The courtroom was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from air conditioning, the kind that settles into your bones when your whole life is being divided into two neat piles on a judge's desk. I sat straight, hands folded, watching the man I had loved for 14 years sign his name without even looking up. No hesitation. No pause. Just the smooth scratch of a pen across paper, like he was signing a delivery receipt. Judge Harlan stamped the final document and said the words that ended everything. Divorce granted. I exhaled slowly. It was over. I told myself I was ready. Then my ex-husband, Nolan Holt, capped his pen, straightened his jacket, and said it. Quietly. Almost casually. Like it was an afterthought. I've already had my will rewritten. My estate goes to my real family now. The air left the room. My daughter Piper, 12 years old, sat beside me. My son Caleb, 15, sat on her other side. I felt them both go completely still. I turned to look at Nolan, waiting for him to laugh, to say he was joking, to show some flicker of the man I once believed he was. He didn't. He looked at our children the way you look at strangers on a bus. Briefly. Without recognition. Something inside me cracked wide open. Outside the courtroom, the afternoon sun felt wrong, too bright, too cheerful for what had just happened inside those walls. Caleb walked close to me, his shoulder touching mine. Piper held my hand without saying anything. We were almost at the car when I heard a woman's voice call Nolan's name. I turned. She was standing near the courthouse steps, tall, polished, wearing a cream blazer. She looked composed, like someone who had been waiting comfortably, not anxiously. Beside her were two children. A boy who looked about 8 and a girl, maybe 6. The little girl ran toward Nolan. "Daddy." He caught her without blinking. Natural. Practiced. Like he had done it 1,000 times before. Because he had. Caleb made a sound beside me, not quite a word, just a sharp breath, like someone had pressed something hard against a bruise. I tightened my grip on Piper's hand. She was staring at the little girl, trying to process what her eyes were showing her. The woman looked at me once. It wasn't a cruel look. It was almost worse than that. It was the look of someone who had already won and no longer needed to compete. Nolan didn't introduce us. Didn't acknowledge the collision of two worlds happening on those courthouse steps. He simply turned, put his hand on the woman's back, and walked away with his other family. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea I never drank. I just held it, letting the warmth seep into my palms while my mind pulled up memories I hadn't looked at clearly in years. The late nights. The client dinners that ran past midnight. The weekends when Nolan flew to meetings in cities that never produced a single contract I could point to. I had accepted every explanation because I trusted him. Because building trust was what marriage meant to me. I had also built his company with him. When Nolan started Holt Consulting 12 years ago, it was just the two of us at our dining room table, me handling the bookkeeping, writing proposals, managing invoices, while he brought in clients. I did all of that while pregnant with Caleb. I did it while nursing Piper. I kept the records clean, the cash flow steady, the business breathing, while Nolan became the face that clients shook hands with. By year 4, the company was worth something real. He hired a proper accountant and gently pushed me out of the day-to-day. I didn't argue. I thought that was growth. Now, sitting in my quiet kitchen, all those late nights rearranged themselves into a different picture entirely. I had been building his escape fund. I couldn't sleep. At 2 in the morning, I opened my laptop and did what I probably should have done months earlier, before the divorce was finalized. I typed her name into the search bar. Nolan had never said her name in court. But his lawyer had referenced a current partner in passing, and I had caught it, Vivian Cord. Her social media profiles were public. I scrolled slowly. Carefully. She was a marketing consultant. Pretty. Confident. Her photos with Nolan started appearing 8 years ago, not recently, not after some spontaneous affair that grew out of loneliness. 8 years ago. Piper had been 4 years old. Caleb had been 7. There were birthday photos, holiday photos, a trip to Portugal. In one picture, Nolan was laughing in a way I hadn't seen him laugh at home in years. Their son, Nolan's other son, was a toddler in the early photos. 8 years. For 8 years, I had packed his suitcase, reminded him about school plays he never attended, made excuses to my children for a father who was simply somewhere else. For 8 years, I had thought our marriage was going through normal rough patches, the kind every couple navigates. I had been navigating alone. He had been living a second life. I closed the laptop. My hands were shaking, but my jaw was set. 2 days after the courthouse, Piper asked me if she had done something wrong. We were in the car, driving home from school. She asked it so quietly that I almost didn't hear her over the radio. I turned it off immediately. My chest felt like it was being compressed. "Baby, no," I said. "You did nothing wrong. Not one single thing. Then why doesn't he want us anymore?" I didn't have a clean answer for that. I pulled into a parking lot, stopped the car, and turned to face her. Her eyes were dry but searching. She was trying so hard to understand something that didn't make sense because it simply wasn't supposed to make sense to a 12-year-old. "Some grown-ups make choices that hurt people who don't deserve to be hurt," I said carefully. "That's about them. It is never, ever about you." She nodded slowly. That evening, Caleb told me that he had sent his father a message asking if they could talk. Nolan had replied with 4 words, "Life isn't always fair." That was it. No phone call. No explanation. No acknowledgement that his son was hurting. Just 4 words, delivered like a fortune cookie to a 15-year-old boy who had done nothing except love a father who had quietly decided to move on. I read the message 3 times. Then I put my phone down and made dinner, because my children needed to eat, and falling apart was not something I could afford to do yet. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Audra Finch, called me 4 days after the ruling. She asked me to come into her office. Her voice had that careful, measured tone that people use when they're about to say something difficult. I sat across from her desk the next morning. "Nolan moved faster than we anticipated," she said, sliding a document toward me. "He restructured several of his business holdings in the 3 months before the divorce filing. Technically, those assets don't exist on paper the way they did before." "Meaning what?" I asked. "Meaning the settlement you received reflects what he declared. But there's reason to believe what he declared was significantly less than what actually exists." She paused. "If he moves the remaining assets into protected structures quickly enough, your children's legal claim to any inheritance becomes almost impossible to enforce." I stared at the document. "He planned this." "Almost certainly," Audra said. "This kind of restructuring doesn't happen overnight. Someone spent months preparing it. Possibly longer." The room felt very quiet. He hadn't just decided to leave. He had engineered his exit, carefully, methodically, making sure that when he walked away with everything that mattered and left us with the appearance of a fair settlement. I drove home thinking about how long a person can smile at you while building a trapdoor beneath your feet. I spent the following weekend going through boxes I had kept in storage. Old business files from the early years of Holt Consulting. Folders I had organized myself, filled with invoices, bank statements, and financial records from before Nolan hired outside help. I had kept everything. I had always been meticulous that way. What I found made me sit on the storage room floor for a long time. In the company's 3rd year, the revenue had been strong enough that we had celebrated with a small vacation to the coast. I remembered that trip. I remembered feeling proud of what we had built. But looking at the actual deposit records now, something was wrong. The bank statements showed incoming payments from 3 major clients. But when I cross-referenced those payments with the company's expense reports from the same period, large sums had been redirected, transferred out in chunks that didn't match any invoice, any supplier, any operational cost I could account for. Small enough amounts, individually, that they wouldn't raise alarm. But consistent. Regular. Month after month after month. The money wasn't going to the business. It was going somewhere else. I pulled out more folders. Each year told the same story, just with larger numbers. Someone had been draining the company quietly, from the inside, for a very long time. I hired a private financial investigator named Soren Bale on Audra's recommendation. He was quiet, methodical, and expensive. Worth every cent. Within 2 weeks, he confirmed what the files had hinted at. There was a property, a townhouse in a neighborhood 40 minutes from where my children and I had lived for 14 years, registered under Vivian Cord's name. Fully paid off. No mortgage. Purchased 6 years ago. The purchase price was $420,000. The funds came from a business account, Soren told me over the phone, his voice flat and professional. A holding company registered under a name that isn't Holt Consulting. But the holding company lists Holt Consulting as its primary revenue source. He used business money, I said. Business money that was never declared as a personal expense or a business asset, Soren confirmed. It was structured to look like a vendor payment. I wrote that down on the notepad in front of me. My handwriting was surprisingly steady. Nolan had bought Vivian a home. A fully paid, $400,000 home, using money that should have been part of the company's assets. Assets that, in a fair divorce, I would have had a legal claim to. Assets that my children, as his beneficiaries, should have had a legal claim to. He hadn't just hidden a second family. He had financially funded one using money that partly belonged to us. There was a moment, and I have thought about it many times since, when I could have stopped digging. When I could have told myself that the settlement was done, the divorce was final, and the healthiest thing was to move forward and not look back. But then I found the documents. Buried in an old accordion folder, I found a stack of papers that Nolan had presented to me 5 years ago. He had been in a hurry that weekend, I remembered that clearly. He'd come home stressed, spread papers on the counter while I was cooking dinner, and asked me to sign several forms quickly. Just business restructuring, he had said. The accountant needs them by Monday. I had trusted him. I had signed. Now I read those documents properly for the first time. One of them was a letter of indemnification. It essentially stated that I acknowledged and accepted responsibility for the company's financial structure as presented. At the time, I had assumed it was standard legal language. It wasn't standard. What it actually did, read carefully by someone who wasn't distracted by a pot on the stove and 2 kids needing dinner, what it actually did was release Nolan from personal liability for a series of financial decisions going back years. He had used my signature to protect himself. I sat with that for a long time. Audra read the indemnification document twice. Then she set it down, laced her fingers together, and looked at me with an expression that mixed admiration with something like controlled outrage. He had this prepared professionally, she said. This is not something a person types up at home. Someone advised him on this. Possibly years in advance. What does it mean for us? I asked. It was designed to make you absorb liability while he walked clean. She tapped the document. But here's what he miscalculated. This document relies on the assumption that the financial structure it references was legal and properly declared. If we can prove that the structure itself involved undeclared income or hidden assets, then this indemnification is built on a fraudulent foundation. Meaning it falls apart. Meaning it falls apart, she confirmed. And more importantly, it becomes evidence of intent. He didn't just hide assets accidentally. He planned for someone to take the blame if it was ever discovered. She paused. He planned for that someone to be you. I looked out her office window at the street below. People were walking past, carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, living ordinary afternoons. I had spent 14 years loving a man who had spent at least 8 of those years constructing a legal and financial trap with my name on it. He had thought he had won. He hadn't finished counting his cards yet. The one thing Nolan had forgotten. The one detail that had slipped through his very carefully constructed plan was that I had never thrown anything away. When he hired his outside accountant in year 4 of the business, I had quietly boxed up every single document from our early years. Invoices, contracts, bank correspondence, email printouts, everything. I had labeled the boxes by year and stored them in our garage, and then later, when we moved, I had transferred them to a storage unit without Nolan ever asking about them or seeming to remember they existed. To him, those early years were ancient history. The company had evolved. Records from that period would have been archived or destroyed in any normal business. But I had kept them. Because I had built those years with my own hands, and some part of me had always valued what they represented. Now they represented something else entirely. They were a complete financial record of Holt Consulting from its beginning, before the restructuring, before the hidden transfers, before Nolan had sanitized everything to tell the story he wanted told. Those boxes contained the original picture, before he had edited it. I called Audra and told her what I had. Her response was a long pause, followed by, "Do not move those boxes. I'm sending someone to catalog them today." Soren Bale spent 3 days with those files. When he called me with his findings, he spoke slowly and clearly, the way people do when they want to make sure every word lands. There are consistent discrepancies between the revenue recorded in these early documents and what was eventually reported to tax authorities, he said. Specifically, in years 3 through 7 of the company, income from at least 4 major clients appears in your original records but is either absent or significantly reduced in the company's official filings. He underreported income, I said. Substantially. We're talking about a combined discrepancy of somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million across that period. A pause. That's not a bookkeeping error. That's a pattern. I pressed my hand flat against the kitchen counter to steady myself. There's more, Soren continued. Some of that undeclared income traces directly to the same holding company used to purchase the property under Ms. Cord's name. The financial trail connects his tax irregularities to the hidden assets, which connects to your divorce settlement. He paused again. Your name appears on several of those original documents as co-signatory, which he likely intended to use against you. But because your documents predate his restructuring, they actually tell the true story, not the one he filed. My original records weren't just evidence. They were the clean version of a story he had tried to rewrite. While Audra and Soren built the legal case quietly, the world outside was moving in its own painful direction. Vivian Cord had apparently decided that staying silent wasn't her style. Caleb showed me his phone one evening. A social media post she had shared publicly, without naming me directly but describing a situation that was unmistakably ours. She called herself the woman who refused to be a secret any longer. She described her relationship with Nolan as a real love that deserved to exist in the light. And then, in the final paragraph, she referred to Nolan's previous life as a comfortable arrangement that served its purpose. A comfortable arrangement. 14 years. 2 children. A business I had helped build from nothing. A comfortable arrangement that served its purpose. Caleb was watching my face carefully when I finished reading. He was 15 and perceptive in the way that children who have been quietly observing adults for years become perceptive. She's wrong, he said simply. I know, I said. Are you okay? I looked at my son, this boy who was already learning that the world could be sharper and more careless than he deserved. And I made a decision in that moment. I was not going to let him watch me perform grief and bitterness. I was going to let him watch me be strategic. I'm better than okay, I told him. I'm focused. 3 weeks after the courthouse, Caleb asked his father for a meeting. Not a text this time. A proper request, a phone call, which Nolan actually answered, possibly out of surprise. Caleb asked if they could meet for lunch. Just the two of them. He said he wanted to understand what was happening. Nolan agreed. I drove Caleb to the restaurant and waited in the car. He was inside for 40 minutes. When he came back out, his face was the kind of careful, controlled blank that teenagers learn to wear when they're holding something painful very still. He got into the car and sat quietly for a moment. He said his new family is his priority now, Caleb said. He said he cares about us, but he has to look forward, not backward. Another pause. He said his son, their son, is going to take over the business one day. I didn't speak. He's 7 years old, Caleb said quietly. The other kid is 7 years old and already has a future planned for him. He turned to look at me. We're not part of the future, Mom. He actually said that. I reached over and put my hand on his arm. He said it, I told my son steadily. That doesn't make it true. And it doesn't make it the end of the story. Caleb looked at me for a long moment. What does it make it? The moment before everything changes, I said. I made a decision that night, and once I made it, everything in me went quiet and calm. I was not going to fight Nolan emotionally. I was not going to argue publicly, post responses, chase him for apologies, or beg courts to force him to be a decent father. None of those things would protect my children in the way that actually mattered. What would protect them was money, legal standing, and documented truth. So I stopped grieving and started working. I organized every piece of evidence into a system. Physical copies in labeled folders. Digital copies encrypted and stored in 3 separate locations. I created a timeline document, month by month, that mapped the financial irregularities Soren had identified against the key events of our marriage. The property purchase. The document I had been rushed into signing. The transfers that didn't match any invoice. Laid out chronologically, it was devastating. It showed a man who had spent nearly a decade constructing a financial exit strategy while living as a husband and father. Every transfer, every hidden account, every redirected payment had a date. And almost all of those dates corresponded to moments I could now recall: vacations he shortened, school events he missed, evenings he worked late. He had been busy, all right. Just not with work. Audra reviewed my timeline and said it was the clearest picture of deliberate financial misconduct she had seen in 15 years of family law. Audra filed the legal challenge on a Tuesday morning in October. It was not a simple divorce appeal. It was a multi-part action covering 3 separate areas: fraudulent asset concealment during divorce proceedings, financial misconduct involving undeclared income and improper use of business funds, and the use of a forged, or more precisely, misleadingly obtained, signature to shield those activities from legal liability. She also filed a separate request to have the original divorce settlement reviewed on the grounds that it had been based on incomplete and deliberately falsified financial disclosures. Nolan's lawyer called Audra within 2 hours. Audra told me about the call with professional calm, but I could hear a trace of satisfaction underneath it. He suggested this was an emotional response to a difficult situation and offered to discuss an informal resolution, she said. What did you say? I told him we had 17 boxes of original financial records, a forensic accountant's report, and a very clear paper trail. She paused. He went quiet for a moment after that. I imagined Nolan in his office, the clean, modern office I had never visited, in the building his rewritten company now occupied, receiving that phone call. Feeling, perhaps for the first time, the ground shift under him the way it had shifted under me on the day of the divorce. We were missing one thing, Audra said. We needed testimony from someone inside the company. Soren tracked him down in 3 days. His name was Walter Price. He had been Holt Consulting's first outside accountant, the man Nolan had hired in year 4 to take over the bookkeeping I had been managing. He had worked there for 2 years and then left abruptly, giving no public reason. He was now running a small tax practice in a town 2 hours away. I drove there myself. Walter Price was a careful man. He met me in a coffee shop, chose a corner table, and spent the first 10 minutes asking cautious questions about what I already knew before he would confirm or deny anything. He had the manner of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and wasn't sure if putting it down was safe. He didn't just ask me to file things a certain way, Walter said finally, wrapping both hands around his coffee cup. He told me what numbers to use. He showed me which transactions to reclassify and how to make the documentation look clean. He paused. When I told him I wasn't comfortable, he suggested my professional reputation was tied to the work I'd already done for him. That if I talked, I'd look as responsible as he was. He had been threatened. And he had stayed quiet for years because of it. "Will you testify?" I asked. He looked at his coffee for a long moment. Then he looked at me. "Yes," he said. "I will." Walter's testimony, delivered in a formal deposition 2 weeks later, was the piece that transformed our case from strong to airtight. He described, with specific dates and transaction numbers, how Nolan had directed him to reclassify genuine revenue as vendor payments, how certain client contracts had been recorded under the holding company rather than Holt Consulting directly, and how Walter had been instructed to maintain 2 sets of records. One for official filing, one that reflected actual figures. He also confirmed something that made Audra set down her pen slowly and deliberately. "Mr. Holt told me specifically," Walter said during the deposition, his voice steady now, "that if the discrepancy was ever discovered, the paper trail would point to his wife. He said she had signed the structural documents and wouldn't be able to prove she didn't understand them." The room was very quiet after that. I had not imagined it. I had not been paranoid or bitter or reading meaning into paperwork I didn't understand. He had planned it. He had named me. He had specifically, deliberately constructed a scenario in which I would be the one left exposed. Walter's testimony connected every piece. The undeclared income. The hidden property. My signature on documents I had been rushed through. The timing of the restructuring before the divorce. It was not a complicated story anymore. It was a clear one. Audra filed the full evidentiary package with the court on a Friday. By Monday, Nolan's legal team had requested an emergency meeting, which the court declined to grant under the circumstances. By Wednesday, the case had been assigned to a senior judge, Judge Constance Ray, who had a reputation for being methodical, patient, and almost impossible to impress with theatrics. Nolan hired 2 additional lawyers. I found that out from Caleb, who had received a brief, stiff message from his father saying that legal matters were being addressed and that Caleb should stay out of it. Caleb showed me the message, and I told him calmly that he didn't need to respond. The week before the first court date, I sat down with both my children and told them as much as I thought they needed to know, which was not everything, but was enough. I told them that their father had made financial decisions that were not legal or fair. I told them we were challenging those decisions in court. I told them it would take time and that some of it would be uncomfortable. Piper asked if we would be okay. "Yes," I said. Firmly. Without hesitation. Caleb asked if his father was going to get in trouble. "He made choices," I said. "Choices have consequences. That's true for everyone." My daughter reached over and took my hand. My son nodded slowly. And the 3 of us sat together in our small, quiet living room, which was not a townhouse paid off with hidden money, but which was entirely, genuinely ours. The first court session was on a gray November morning. Nolan walked in with his legal team, 3 lawyers now, all in expensive suits, and he looked composed. Controlled. He had the posture of a man who believed the room was manageable. I had seen that posture across the dinner table for years. The slight lift of the chin. The measured movements. The quiet confidence of someone who had prepared for every variable. He hadn't prepared for Walter Price. He hadn't prepared 17 boxes of original records. He hadn't prepared for Soren Bale's forensic report, which Audra entered into evidence in the first session as calmly as someone setting down a cup of tea. Judge Ray reviewed the initial documentation without visible reaction, which I had been warned was her style. She asked several precise questions about the timeline of the holding company's formation relative to the divorce filing. Nolan's lead lawyer answered smoothly. Then she asked Nolan directly when he had first established the holding company. He said 4 years ago. Audra produced a registration document dated 6.5 years ago. Nolan's lawyer immediately requested a brief recess. Judge Ray denied it. I looked at my hands in my lap. I did not smile. I did not react. I simply breathed steadily and let the evidence do what evidence does when it is true and properly documented. It speaks for itself. The second session, 2 weeks later, went deeper. Judge Ray had clearly reviewed everything thoroughly between sessions. Her questions were sharper now, less exploratory, more surgical. She asked about specific transactions. She asked about the classification of the property purchase. She asked about the indemnification document I had signed and when, precisely, it had been prepared. Nolan's answers began to drift. Not dramatically, he was too practiced for that. But there were pauses where there shouldn't have been pauses. Clarifications that created new inconsistencies. Moments where he deferred to his lawyer with a glance that was just slightly too quick. Judge Ray noticed. You could see it in the way she made notes, the pen moving with a new kind of deliberateness. His financial records, when cross-examined against our original documents, told two different stories. His version showed a company that had modest early profits, careful growth, and clean accounting. Our version showed the actual numbers, the ones I had recorded before he had the chance to revise history. The gap between the two versions was not small. Audra presented Walter Price's deposition transcript. Nolan's lawyer objected twice. Both objections were overruled. When the session ended, I walked out of the courtroom beside Audra. She didn't say much. But as we reached the top of the courthouse steps, she looked sideways at me and said, "He's running out of room." I nodded. I had started to feel it too, that slow, irreversible narrowing of space around someone who has built their safety on a structure that is now visibly crumbling. The court froze Nolan's assets while the fraud investigation continued. This meant his business accounts were inaccessible. His personal accounts were restricted to basic living expenses. The holding company, and everything tied to it, was locked pending review. The townhouse under Vivian's name was flagged as a potentially fraudulent transfer of assets and placed under a legal hold. I heard about Vivian's reaction secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance who had no particular reason to protect anyone's feelings. Apparently, she had arrived at the property one afternoon to find a legal notice on the door. She had called Nolan in a fury. He had told her to stay calm. She did not stay calm. The woman who had described my 14-year marriage as a comfortable arrangement that served its purpose, who had looked at me on courthouse steps without blinking, was now discovering that the financial foundation of her carefully constructed life was as real as the declarations of a man who had been lying to multiple people for nearly a decade. She hired her own lawyer. I was told she spent 3 days trying to establish that she had no knowledge of the fraudulent transfers, that she had simply been the recipient of gifts from a partner she had trusted. Audra reviewed that claim and said it was going to be a difficult argument for her to sustain, given the timeline and amounts involved. Loyalty, it turned out, had a financial threshold. Vivian's lawyer contacted the court independently. This was the part that Nolan had not calculated. He had managed me for 14 years by controlling information, deciding what I knew, what I signed, what I saw. He had likely assumed Vivian, who had been his partner in concealment for 8 years, would hold the same line. He had miscalculated her entirely. Facing the possibility that the townhouse, her home, the one she had believed was secure and fully hers, might be reclaimed as a fraudulent asset, Vivian made a decision that was entirely rational from her position and completely catastrophic for Nolan's. She disclosed 3 additional accounts. Accounts that her own lawyer had unearthed in the process of building her defense. Accounts registered under variations of the holding company's name, in 2 different financial institutions. Accounts that contained a combined balance that significantly exceeded anything Nolan had declared in the divorce proceedings. The full picture, when these accounts were added to what we already had, was staggering. Nolan had not simply hidden assets. He had built an entire parallel financial life, funded by years of undeclared business income, structured through a web of holding entities, and maintained in accounts that appeared on no document related to our marriage or the divorce. He had planned to walk away wealthy while my children received nothing. Vivian's disclosure didn't come from loyalty to me, but it dismantled him completely, and the result was the same. Judge Ray delivered the final ruling on a cold Thursday morning in January. The courtroom was fuller than it had been for previous sessions. I sat beside Audra. Caleb had asked to be there. He was 15, and I had decided he was old enough to see what accountability looked like when it was real. Piper had stayed home with my sister. Judge Ray spoke for nearly 40 minutes. She confirmed that the forensic evidence demonstrated deliberate and sustained financial misconduct spanning at least 7 years. She confirmed that the divorce settlement had been based on materially false financial disclosures, rendering it legally invalid as originally structured. She confirmed that the indemnification document I had signed was obtained under misleading circumstances and could not be used as a legal shield. The original settlement was struck. A new one was calculated based on the actual, documented assets, including the hidden accounts, the holding company's value, and the property that had been purchased with redirected funds. My children were reinstated as rightful legal beneficiaries under the estate restructuring. Any future disinheriting them without just cause would face an immediate legal challenge, now that the fraudulent framework had been dismantled. Nolan's company was referred to financial authorities for further investigation of the tax irregularities. He sat at his table and said nothing. Caleb sat beside me and said nothing either. But he took my hand and held it, this 15-year-old boy who had been told he was not part of the future. And he held it firmly until Judge Ray finished speaking. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does after a long winter, gradually, quietly, until one morning you notice the light is different and the air has changed and something has shifted without announcing itself. Nolan appeared at my door on a Saturday afternoon in April. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but in the way that people look when the structure they have built their confidence around has been taken apart piece by piece. He was wearing a jacket I recognized from years ago. He hadn't updated his wardrobe recently, apparently. He said he wanted to talk about the kids. I stood in the doorway and looked at him calmly. I was not angry. Anger had burned clean through me months ago and left something steadier in its place. Caleb and Piper will decide if and when they want a relationship with you, I said. That is entirely their choice. I will not influence it either way. He said he had made mistakes. Yes, I said simply. He said he hoped we could find a way forward. You should speak to your children about that, I said. Not me. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Caleb appeared at my shoulder. Piper came to stand in the doorway beside me. The three of us looked at Nolan together. Not with hatred, not with pleading, just with the clear, quiet steadiness of people who had survived something and come through it intact. Nolan looked at his children for a long moment. Whatever he saw in their faces, it was enough to make him look away first. He said he would reach out. He walked back to his car. I closed the door gently, and the three of us stood in our hallway together in the ordinary, unhurried quiet of a Saturday morning, which was entirely, genuinely, completely ours.